Corin had never imagined that his mission would bring him here, to the grand hall of the Xerian palace. The galaxy was full of mysteries, but none more terrifying than the Xerian Empress, Nirixa. As a human diplomat, Corin had seen his fair share of powerful leaders, but none like her. The Xerians were an ancient species known for their cold, emotionless rule. Their empire had stood for centuries, built on a foundation of strength, fear, and control. And Nirixa, the Empress, was the heart of that power. She was as beautiful as she was dangerous, with sharp, icy features and eyes that could freeze any enemy in their tracks. As Corin entered the palace, he couldn't help but feel small and insignificant. The palace was massive, its walls lined with statues of Xerian warriors and shimmering crystals that cast an eerie glow across the stone floors. Everything in this place seemed to hum with power, with the weight of history bearing down on him. He had come here with a single purpose: to negotiate a peace treaty. But as he walked deeper into the palace, he began to question whether such a thing was even possible. The Xerians were known for their fearsome warriors, but their Empress was something else entirely. It wasn't just her military might that made her formidable. It was her ability to control the emotions of those around her. No one could challenge her. No one could question her. And yet, Corin had been sent to do just that, to convince her to make peace with the rebels who threatened the stability of the galaxy. Corin had studied everything he could about Nirixa before coming here. He knew that she valued strength above all else, strength in battle, strength in leadership, and above all, strength in resolve. The Xerians had no use for weakness, for emotion. Fear, especially, was seen as a fatal flaw. And yet Corin knew that to understand Nirixa, he had to give her something she wasn't expecting. When he arrived at the Grand Hall, he was met by a sea of Xerian soldiers and officials, all dressed in the same dark, imposing armor. They stood at attention as he passed, their eyes never leaving him. At the far end of the hall, atop a raised platform, sat the Empress herself. She was surrounded by her closest advisors, her presence more commanding than anything Corin had ever encountered. As he approached, Corin's heart pounded in his chest. He had faced countless dangers in his life, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. It wasn't just the palace that intimidated him. It was the woman at its center. Nirixa's gaze was like a weapon, sharp and unyielding. But as he walked closer, something inside him shifted. Corin had come here to bargain, to convince Nirixa that peace was the only way forward. But as he looked up at her, he realized something. The Xerians, despite their power, were afraid. Afraid of their past, afraid of the future, and most of all, afraid of their own emotions. Nirixa ruled with an iron fist, but it was a fist clenched in fear. It was then that Corin made a decision. Instead of trying to hide his own fear, he would offer it to her. He would give her the one thing she least expected, a glimpse into the heart of a human being. When he reached the platform, he bowed respectfully, but his words were anything but conventional. "Empress Nirixa," he began, his voice steady but filled with an emotion he couldn't suppress. "I have come here with a proposal for peace, but before we speak of treaties or alliances, I must first offer you something." The room fell silent, all eyes on Corin. Nirixa didn't speak, but her gaze intensified, as if weighing him with those piercing eyes. Corin felt his pulse quicken, but he didn't look away. He had to do this. "I offer you my fear," he said, the words tumbling from his lips before he could stop them. I am afraid of you, of what you represent, of the power you wield. But more than that, I am afraid for the galaxy, for the future of my people. But I do not hide from this fear. I give it to you. It is all I have to offer." There was a long, heavy silence as the words hung in the air. Corin's heart raced. He had expected anger or disbelief, but what came next was something he hadn't anticipated. Nirixa did not react with fury, nor did she dismiss him. Instead, her eyes softened. For a brief moment, Corin thought he had imagined it, but then he saw it again, a flicker of something unfamiliar in her gaze. It wasn't pity, nor was it contempt. It was curiosity. She was studying him, as though trying to understand what he had just done.
You offer me your fear?
Nerixa's voice was low, almost like a whisper, but it carried across the room with a strange power.
Yes, Corin said, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts to remain composed.
Fear is not a weakness, Empress. It is a part of us all.
And I offer it to you because I believe that even you, in your power, must know what it means to fear. Nyrixa stood, her movement graceful and calculated, like a predator assessing its prey. She stepped down from the platform, her eyes never leaving Corin. As she approached him, the room seemed to hold its breath. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Corin stood his ground, his heart pounding. He had expected to be dismissed, perhaps even punished for his boldness. But Nyrixa's expression remained unreadable as she stopped just a few feet away from him. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, Nyrixa broke the silence. Fear, she said softly, is a concept I have never truly understood. My people are bred to be strong, to suppress our emotions. Fear has no place in our hearts. But you are different. You wear your fear like a cloak, not ashamed of it, but offering it freely.
Why?
Corin swallowed hard, his words coming more easily now that the initial shock of the situation had worn off. Because fear is not something to hide from, Empress. It makes us human. And in this moment, I am offering you my fear as a sign of trust. I trust that you will understand, even if you don't feel the same way. Nyrixa studied him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she spoke again.
You are brave, Corin,
She said, her voice almost a whisper. But your fear does not change the reality of our situation. I rule with power, and I will not be swayed by the weakness of emotions. Corin felt a pang of disappointment but didn't show it. He knew that his gesture had not made the impact he had hoped for. Still, something had shifted in the air between them. Nyrixa had reacted differently than he expected. Instead of dismissing him outright, she had taken the time to consider his words. But as he left the grand hall that day, Corin couldn't shake the feeling that his offering of fear had done something more than he realized. Nyrixa had seen him, truly seen him, not as an enemy or a diplomat, but as a human being. And in that brief exchange, something had begun to change. Corin didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since arriving on this alien world, he felt a spark of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, peace wasn't as impossible as he had believed. The days that followed Corin's bold declaration were filled with tension. Though Empress Nyrixa had not dismissed his words, she hadn't acted on them either. The entire palace seemed to hold its breath as Corin moved through the corridors, awaiting his next meeting with the Empress. It was as though the very walls of the palace had absorbed the weight of his fear, and now everything felt like it was teetering on the edge. Corin had come to Zirian space with a single purpose: to convince Nyrixa to make peace with the rebels threatening the stability of the galaxy. The galaxy was on the brink of war, and the Zirians had the power to end it, but he didn't know how to reach her. How could he negotiate with someone who had never known weakness? How could he persuade a ruler who had built her empire on fear to choose peace over domination? Corin had thought that showing his fear would somehow make a difference. He had hoped that by offering it to Nyrixa, he could prove that even the strongest of leaders could have doubts, could have weaknesses. But Nyrixa had not reacted in the way he had expected. Instead of anger or disdain, she had listened, her eyes reflecting something Corin couldn't place. Curiosity, perhaps, or even understanding. Still, nothing had changed. She had not agreed to peace, and the war between the rebels and the Zirians raged on. Corin's mission felt as distant as ever, and the gap between him and Nyrixa felt wider than it had been before. It wasn't until the third day after his confession that Corin found himself summoned once again to the Empress's presence. The invitation was simple. "You will meet with me at the palace hall this evening." There were no words of encouragement or expectation, only the cold command that Corin had become accustomed to during his time on the planet. As he made his way through the palace once again, the same feelings of dread and awe gripped him. He had seen Nyrixa's power in her eyes when they first met. He had felt the weight of her gaze, like a physical force. But now, there was something else, something more human, that lingered in the air. He wasn't sure if it was his own imagination, or if the Empress had changed in some subtle way. Corin entered the hall, and there she was, sitting on her throne as she had before. But this time, her expression was different. She wasn't looking at him with the cold distance that had marked their first encounter. Instead, her eyes were intense, searching.
It was as if she was trying to understand him in a way that had not been possible before.
"You have returned," Nyrixa said, her voice smooth and controlled, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper.
"Tell me, Corin, what is it you seek from me?" Corin stood before her, his heart pounding. The moment was now more crucial than ever. He had offered his fear, but it was clear to him now that it had not been enough. Nyrixa had seen the gift he had given her, but it had not been enough to convince her of the value of peace. Now, he had to find another way in. "I seek peace," Corin replied. His voice was steady, but his words felt heavy. "I seek an end to the bloodshed." "I understand the power of your empire, Empress, and I know that you could crush the rebels without a second thought. But power alone will not bring peace. It will only bring more war." Nyrixa's eyes narrowed slightly. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, but it was gone before Corin could make sense of it. "You believe that peace is possible through weakness?" she asked, her voice sharp.
No, Corin replied quickly. I believe that peace is possible through understanding.
Through seeing one another as more than just enemies or threats.
You've built your empire on fear, Empress. But fear alone cannot hold the galaxy together.
People live in constant fear under your rule. But you can change that. You can give them hope, not just for survival, but for a better future. Nyrixa's expression remained unreadable, but Corin could see that she was listening. The tension in the air between them seemed to thicken, and for a moment, neither spoke. The room was filled with a strange, uncomfortable silence that hung between them like a tangible presence. Finally, Nyrixa stood from her throne and descended the steps to where Corin stood. As she approached, Corin instinctively took a step back, but he forced himself to remain composed. The Empress was close now, too close, and Corin could feel the power radiating off her in waves. He was afraid, yes, but there was something else, something more than fear. There was curiosity, and maybe, just maybe, there was a flicker of understanding. "You speak of peace," Nyrixa said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "But do you understand what it means to rule, to hold the weight of an empire on your shoulders?" "You think I have not tried to understand? You think that I have not seen the destruction and the loss that comes with war? You think I do not fear the possibility of losing everything I have built?" Corin was taken aback. For the first time, Nyrixa's voice softened, and there was an edge of vulnerability in her words. She was not the invincible Empress he had imagined. She was a ruler, yes, but she was also a person who had experienced loss. A person who, perhaps, had fears of her own.
I have seen it, Nyrixa continued, her voice steadying.
The pain of losing loved ones, the devastation of watching my people crumble. But I do not let fear control me. I do not let it weaken me. Corin stood silently, unsure of what to say. Nyrixa's words were not what he had expected. He had thought that she would dismiss his offer of peace, that she would continue down the path of ruthless domination. But instead, she had opened up to him. In a way, she had shown him a glimpse of what lay beneath the cold exterior of the Empress. "I understand now," Nerixa said, her gaze never leaving Corin's face. "I understand why you offered me your fear. It is not a weakness, as I once thought. It is part of what makes you human. Fear is a part of all of us. But you must know that it is not enough to simply acknowledge it. It must be controlled. It must be mastered." Corin felt a strange shift in the air as she spoke. The walls of the palace seemed to close in around him, but this time, it was not the weight of fear that pressed against him. It was something else. It was the weight of understanding. Nerixa was no longer just the Empress. She was a leader who had seen the cost of war, the cost of fear. And for the first time, Corin realized that she was not as far from him as he had once believed. "I will not offer you peace without understanding," Corin said finally. "I will not offer you peace without knowing that you, too, can see the value in it. But I believe that it is possible, and I believe that you can make that choice, Empress." Nerixa looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded slowly. "I will consider your words, Corin. You may have given me more than you realize. But do not mistake this for weakness. Peace will come when it is earned, not given." Corin nodded, his heart still pounding but filled with a strange sense of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, and the galaxy was still on the brink of war. But for the first time, Corin felt that peace might not be as impossible as it had seemed. The Empress was not invincible. She was not beyond reach, and perhaps, just perhaps, they could find a way to make peace together. As Corin left the palace that evening, he couldn't help but wonder what the future held. The Zirians were not an easy people to persuade, but Nerixa, for all her power, was still human. And that, Corin realized, was the key to everything. The days that followed Corin's meeting with Empress Nerixa were tense, filled with a sense of anticipation that Corin couldn't quite shake. After their conversation in the Grand Hall, Corin had hoped that the Empress would take a step toward peace. He had offered his fear, his vulnerability, and he had seen a flicker of something in her eyes, something that suggested she was starting to question the way she had always ruled. But the galaxy was still on the brink of war, and the rebel factions were still gathering strength. Corin knew that time was running out. If Nerixa didn't agree to peace soon, the entire galaxy could fall into chaos. Corin spent his days walking through the palace, pondering his next move. He had come here to negotiate peace, but now he was beginning to see that the true challenge was not just in talking to Nerixa. The true challenge was helping her see a different way of ruling, one that was not based on fear and control, but on understanding and trust. He had given her the gift of his fear, but it wasn't enough to change the foundations of an empire built on centuries of tradition. It wasn't long before Corin was once again summoned to the throne room. He had been expecting the call, but when it finally came, he couldn't help but feel a mix of dread and hope. Nerixa had promised to consider his words, but he wasn't sure what that meant. Had she changed her mind? Or was she simply toying with him, testing his resolve? Corin arrived at the palace hall to find the room empty, except for Nerixa. She stood near the center of the room, her back to him, staring out of the large windows that overlooked the city below. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the landscape. Corin couldn't help but admire the view. The Zirians had built their empire in a way that was both beautiful and imposing, a reflection of their strength and their desire to control everything they touched. "Corin!" Nerixa's voice broke the silence, and Corin's heart skipped a beat. There was no anger in her tone, no coldness, just an odd quietness that he couldn't place.
"You have given me much to think about."
Corin stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back. He was careful not to show too much emotion, but inside, he was anxious. "I only spoke the truth, Empress. I believe that peace is possible, if only we are willing to see each other differently." Nerixa turned to face him, her piercing gaze locking onto his.
And what of my people, my empire?
Do you truly believe that they will accept a leader who has shown weakness? Fear? Her voice was steady, but Corin could hear the underlying tension in her words.
I don't believe it's weakness, Corin replied, his voice calm but firm. I believe it's strength.
The strength to admit that we don't have all the answers. The strength to embrace our emotions, instead of burying them.
You have spent your entire life ruling through fear, Empress. But fear cannot build lasting peace. It can only create more conflict. Nyrixa's eyes flickered, just for a moment, before she looked away. She paced across the room deep in thought. I have spent my entire life building this empire, Corin, she said, her voice quieter now. I have sacrificed everything to make sure that my people are safe, that they are strong. Fear is the only thing that holds us together. Without it, we would crumble. I understand your fear, Corin said gently. I understand that you feel responsible for your people. But there is another way. A way to lead with trust, not with fear. A way to show your people that they don't have to live in constant dread. Nyrixa stopped pacing and turned back to him, her expression softer than it had ever been. And what makes you so sure that your way will work?
What if it makes everything worse?
Corin took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that this was the moment of truth.
Because I believe that the strength of a leader lies not in their ability to instill fear, but in their ability to inspire hope. If you show your people that you are willing to change, willing to listen, they will follow you. They will trust you. But if you continue to rule with fear, you will only create more enemies, and your empire will collapse under its own weight. Nyrixa looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Corin could see the conflict in her eyes. He could see that she was torn between the life she had always known and the possibility of something different. For the first time, he saw a glimpse of vulnerability in the Empress. She was not the invincible, unshakable ruler she had once seemed. She was a woman who had known pain, loss, and fear, just like everyone else. I cannot change overnight, Corin, Nyrixa said softly. The people expect me to be strong, to be unwavering. I cannot simply abandon everything I have built.
You don't have to abandon it, Corin replied.
You can evolve. You can build a new foundation, one that is based on understanding, not fear. It won't be easy, but it is possible. And it starts with you. Nyrixa was silent for a long time, and for a moment, Corin thought she might reject him completely. But then, to his surprise, she nodded slowly. Perhaps you are right, she said quietly. Perhaps I have been ruling through fear for too long. But it is difficult to see beyond the walls I have built. It is difficult to imagine a different way. Corin stepped forward, offering a small smile. It's never too late to start. Nyrixa looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. And what of you, Corin? What do you want from all of this? You came here to make peace, but what do you truly want? Corin hesitated for a moment before answering. I want a future where we can live without fear, where we don't have to fight for every inch of peace.
I want to help create a galaxy where trust and understanding replace violence and war. Nyrixa studied him for a long moment before speaking again.
You are a strange human, Corin. Your willingness to trust, to offer your fear so freely, but it is unlike anything I have ever seen. And yet, I find myself considering your words. For the first time, Corin felt a sense of hope rising within him. Nyrixa was listening. She was considering a new way forward, a new path for herself and for the galaxy.
It wasn't a guarantee of success, but it was a start.
And that was more than he had ever hoped for.
You have given me much to think about, Nyrixa said, her voice more thoughtful than before.
Perhaps Perhaps I have been wrong. Perhaps there is a way to lead without fear, but I will need time to understand it, time to see if it is truly possible. Corin nodded, his heart filled with a mixture of relief and anticipation. I understand. Take all the time you need, Empress.
I will be here when you're ready. Nyrixa gave him a small nod, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. Thank you, Corin.
I will not forget what you have said. And perhaps you are right. Perhaps there is another way.
As Corin left the throne room, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment.
It wasn't the peace he had hoped for, not yet, but it was a step in the right direction. Nyrixa was starting to see the possibility of change, and that was all he could ask for. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time, Corin felt that the galaxy might have a chance at peace, after all. The weeks that followed Corin's conversation with Nyrixa were tense but also filled with a strange sense of anticipation. Nyrixa had promised to consider his words, to think about the possibility of ruling without fear. It was a bold promise, and for the first time Corin could sense a change in the air, something that had not been there before. The Empress, the woman who had always been seen as invincible, was starting to question the very foundations of her empire. Corin couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. The galaxy still teetered on the edge of war. The rebel factions were gathering strength, and their leaders were growing more aggressive with each passing day. Nyrixa's empire was powerful, but it was also deeply divided. The people were afraid of their rulers, afraid of their future, and afraid of what would happen if the war didn't end soon. Corin knew that Nyrixa had the power to end the conflict, but it was up to her to choose how to use that power. Corin's own role in this was clear. He had to continue to push Nyrixa toward peace, to show her that it was not only possible, but necessary for the future of the galaxy. But as much as he wanted to help, he knew that the path to peace was not going to be easy. It would take time, patience, and above all, trust. One evening, Corin was once again summoned to the palace. He had become familiar with the routine by now, but there was something different about this time. There was a sense of urgency in the air, something that made Corin's heart race as he made his way through the corridors of the palace. As he approached the throne room, he could hear voices that were not Nyrixa's. When he entered, he found the Empress standing at the far end of the room, surrounded by her most trusted advisors. They were engaged in a heated discussion, and Corin could feel the tension in the air. Nyrixa's face was set in a grim expression, and the others seemed to be arguing with her, trying to convince her to take a more forceful stance against the rebels. The room was filled with anger and frustration, and for a moment, Corin hesitated at the door. He had seen the way Nyrixa ruled, cold, calculating, and without mercy. She had built her empire on fear, and for a long time, that had been enough. But now, Corin could sense that she was starting to question the very thing that had made her so powerful. Fear had been her weapon, but now it was also her prison. "Empress, you cannot be serious," one of the advisors said, his voice trembling with anger. "The rebels are growing bolder by the day. We must strike them down before they can rally more support. If we wait too long, we will lose everything." Nyrixa didn't respond immediately. She stood with her back straight, her eyes focused on the window, as though lost in thought. Corin could see that she was struggling, torn between the way she had always ruled and the possibility of something different. "Peace," she said quietly, almost to herself. "What is peace? Can it truly be achieved? Can we trust our enemies to keep their word? Can we afford to be weak?" Corin stepped forward, his presence breaking the tension in the room. Nyrixa's eyes flicked toward him, and for a moment he saw something in her gaze. Uncertainty, doubt, fear.
"Empress,"
Corin said, his voice steady. "You are not weak for seeking peace."
You are not weak for choosing a different path. Fear is not strength.
Fear is a cage that traps you, just as it traps your people. Nyrixa's advisors looked at him, but Nyrixa herself didn't speak. Instead, She turned away from him and walked toward the center of the room, her steps slow and measured.
You have spoken of peace, she said, her voice soft but firm.
And I have listened, but the reality is that we... at war. The galaxy is on fire. If we do not act, everything we have built will be destroyed. Corin stepped closer, his heart pounding. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when Nirixa would either choose the path of fear or the path of hope.
War will only destroy, Corin said, his voice filled with conviction. It will destroy everything, your empire, your people, and even yourself.
You've spent your whole life building something that is based on fear. But fear cannot build a future. Only hope can do that. Nirixa looked at him, her expression unreadable. Hope. She repeated the word as though testing it. I have never ruled with hope. I have ruled with strength, with fear. And it has been enough. Corin shook his head. No, it hasn't. Your people are afraid. They live in fear of you. Fear of your empire, fear of the future. But you don't have to rule through fear anymore. You don't have to be alone in this.
Let go of the fear that has held you back, and you will see that there is another way. Nirixa's gaze softened, just for a moment.
But then her shoulders stiffened, and her face hardened again.
And what of the rebels?
What of the enemies who seek to destroy everything I've built? Can you promise me that they will stop fighting if I choose peace?
I can't promise that,
Corin said honestly. But I can promise that peace is worth fighting for. It may not come easily, but it is possible. And if you choose peace, your people will follow you. They will trust you. They will no longer live in fear. They will stand by you. Nirixa was silent for a long time, her eyes distant as she thought over his words. The room was still, the only sound the faint hum of the palace in the background. Finally, she turned to face him again, her expression softer than it had been before. I have been afraid, she said, her voice quiet.
Afraid of losing control, afraid of showing weakness.
But perhaps, there is another way.
Perhaps I have been wrong. Corin's heart surged with hope.
This was the moment. Nirixa was starting to see the truth. She was starting to understand what he had been trying to tell her all along. Empress, Corin said, his voice filled with quiet urgency.
You don't have to do this alone. You don't have to face this war alone.
Let go of the fear that has ruled your life. Choose peace. Choose hope. Nirixa looked at him, her expression filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. I have ruled through fear for so long, she said softly. It is all I have known. But perhaps it is time to change. Perhaps it is time to see if hope can truly replace fear. For the first time, Corin saw the faintest glimmer of a smile on her lips. It was small, but it was there. And in that moment, Corin knew that Nirixa was no longer the same woman who had first entered his life. She had changed. She was beginning to understand that peace was possible. Not through power, not through fear, but through trust, understanding, and hope.
I will take the first step, Nirixa said, her voice steady but filled with emotion.
I will choose peace, but it will take time, and it will not be easy. There are many who will resist, but I will try, for the sake of my people, for the sake of the galaxy. Corin smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks.
I believe in you, Empress. I believe that you can do this.
And I will be here to help you, every step of the way.
Nirixa nodded, her eyes meeting his with a new sense of purpose.
Then, let us begin. As Corin left the palace that evening, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope rising within him. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be resistance. There would be obstacles. But Nyrixa had taken the first step, and that was all that mattered. The path to peace was long, but it was no longer impossible. For the first time, Corin felt that peace was within reach.